you should have already pulled this page, the Revolutionary Leaders Jigsaw page, into Notability. There are several people on here. We're not going to do all of them today. You will carry this into tomorrow. But we are going to do a few today. We're going to start with King George and George Washington. They're in the same reading, and we're going to do those together. And then later today, after we get finished with that, you are going to, if I can find it, here it goes. You're going to do Patrick Henry and Benjamin Franklin. So if you look at your page, you're doing the bottom 4 today is my goal. And then we'll do the top 5 tomorrow. So we are going to start with King George and George Washington. The first thing that I want to notice are the questions. So the first question is allegiance. And allegiance means what side do they fight for? Which side do they stand with? It's kind of like when we were talking about an argument. Which side of the argument are you on? But there are 3 sides here. So either they're a patriot, and we've talked about a patriot before. Those were people that were on the side of the colonists. They were the ones that were against what the king was doing, what Great Britain was doing. They were protesting. They were adamant about becoming their own country. Those were patriots. The loyalists were people that were in the colonies that were still loyal to the king. So they didn't see a fault in what the king was doing. They felt like they should stay connected to Great Britain. They didn't want to create their own country. Those were the loyalists. And finally, there were people that were neutral. And the neutralists were just people that didn't really have a side. They hadn't decided if they were on the side of the colonists that wanted to separate. They weren't necessarily a loyalist. They were neutral. They were in the middle. So we need to decide of these 2 people, which I'm hoping King George we already know, but we're going to circle whether they were a patriot, a loyalist, or neutral, what they were famous for, and then one other piece of information that we found interesting. And if you notice up here, it's the same questions for all of these people. You will notice that Samuel Adams has a bigger section, meaning that we're just going to find more information on them. But that's the question for each person, is just what's their allegiance, what were they famous for? And saying that, I do want to kind of talk about or revisit a little bit when we talked about in our argument unit how sometimes we see information or we see a page that has a ton of information and we think, nope, never mind. That's okay if you don't want to read every single word. You might just be really interested in the person and you want to read everything about them. Personally, I'm going to read most of what's on this page for us today. But when it comes to the other people, if you want to skim and scan a little bit, I'm okay with that. What I will say is on this part where it says, what is he famous for? It's not just any information. I'm looking for something kind of specific. So what was he famous for in terms of the American Revolution? Because George Washington is famous for many things. King George would be famous for many things. Benjamin Franklin is famous for many things. But we're talking about in reference to the American Revolution. I want to know why they were so famous. Why are we talking about them when we talk about the American Revolution? What did they do to either help the colonists during the American Revolution? What did they do to help Great Britain? What was important about them in reference to the American Revolution? So make sure that you're being really picky on what you put they're famous for. And then the other information is just something else that you find interesting from the article. This one doesn't have to be specific. There could be lots of options for other information. So let's dive into George versus George. If you want to pull this up and have this video playing in the background while you read along with me, that's fine. If you just want to follow along on the screen, that's okay too. The British and the American colonists were both led by powerful men during the Revolutionary War. Ironically, both men were named George. King George III was the ruler of Great Britain, and George Washington was the commander of the American Continental Army. Both men had light blue eyes, enjoyed farming, and were important leaders. Despite these similarities, they had very different ideas about power and governing. First off, I'm still at school, and I'm hoping you can't hear the construction going on in the back because it still feels like our room is shaking to pieces. But I'll tell you, I heard some important information right there in the beginning, saying that King George was the ruler of Great Britain and that George Washington was the commander of the American Army. I'm going to keep that in mind, but I'm not ready to write that down because I want to double check that there wasn't anything more specific that I want to put. Men of the world. King George III became the King of Great Britain when he was just 22 years old. He and his wife Charlotte had 15 children and owned many homes. King George III loved to read. He opened a royal collection of books and founded the Royal Academy of Arts. George was the first king to study science. His collection of scientific instruments was so large that some of his instruments are still on display in museums today. King George III was also very interested in farming. His nickname was Farmer George. George III was one of the most well-rounded kings in English history. George Washington and his wife Martha had 2 children, both of which came from Martha's previous marriage. They lived in a country home in Virginia and worked their land for a living. Washington became involved in the French and Indian War when he was just 22 years old. This is where he made a name for himself as a strong military leader. Washington was different from many other American presidents. He valued hard work more than anyone else, and he worked on his family's farm in Virginia for many years before the Revolutionary War. He did not write any important essays or books like many later presidents did, but rather Washington was a simple family man. He was dedicated to honesty, hard work, and loyal to his country. I've already heard lots of information we could put in the other information section, but I'm not ready to do that yet. But what I am ready, and I kind of forgot about, is to mark what they are. So their allegiance. Obviously, King George, he's a loyalist. He's loyal to himself, right? He's on the side of Great Britain. George Washington, we know he fought on the American side during the American Revolutionary War, so he was definitely a patriot. So we've got those. Let's keep reading for the famous 4. Just make sure we've covered everything. Men of character. George III was very shy as a young boy growing up in Great Britain. His mother was very tough on him. She taught him to have strong moral values. Before becoming king, George III had to learn to overcome his shyness. He was a very religious boy and he prayed often. And after he had become king, he was so angered by his son and brother's poor behavior that he passed a law that made it illegal for members of the royal family to marry without the king's approval. He was a deep thinker. George Washington was a humble man. He was a man of his word that was dedicated to his country. Before accepting command of the Continental Army, Washington promised Congress that he would give up his position when the war ended. Many Americans believed George Washington would want to become the king of the newly freed country, but Washington was too humble for that. He stepped down from his powerful position as leader of the army as soon as the Revolutionary War ended. Washington returned to his home in Mount Vernon, Virginia, and continued his life as a farmer. Men of power. George III became the king of Great Britain after his grandfather George II's death in 1760. This was during the middle of the 7 Years' War, or the French and Indian War. The 7 Years' War was also known as the French and Indian War. George III oversaw the successful end of the war in 1763. The British victory made George III the ruler of the most powerful nation in the world. As a leader, George III was known for trusting his advisors. He had opinions of his own, but he usually relied on the wisdom of others. Believe it or not, King George III wasn't responsible for passing the laws and taxes that angered the colonists in the time period prior to the Revolutionary War. However, he did allow them to pass through Parliament and become laws. So he wasn't the one that was pushing for these laws necessarily, but he did allow them, so he was kind of guilty by association there. George Washington had been a very strong general in the Revolutionary War. His decisions during the war played a major part in the colonists' victory over Great Britain. Americans greatly admired him for this. After the war ended, Washington was unanimously selected to become the President of the United States. Unanimously here means that everybody voted. There was nobody that was against it. He served 2 terms as president from 1789 to 1797. Washington had a very clear vision for the United States. He established short-term and long-term goals. He wanted to protect the union of the states, following the Constitution, and set up a government that was governed and trusted by the people. Washington surprised everyone by retiring at the end of 2 terms as president. He felt he had done all he could to help young America. He also wanted to set a standard that the nation would not be ruled by a king-like figure. He was very different from the type of ruler Americans were used to. All they had known was a long-ruling dominant king. Finally, men of legacy. George III's health declined during the American Revolution. He was troubled with disease that attacked his ability to think clearly during the last years of his reign. He kept his title as King of the United Kingdom, but his son was given control of the nation in 1811. This was the year that George III was declared to be mentally unfit to rule. George III became deaf and blind a few years later. After serving as king for almost 60 years, he died in 1820. George Washington had a long-lasting legacy. He was the powerful leader of the Continental Army during the American Revolution. He was the first American president. Most importantly, he decided to step down from the office of president after serving 2 terms. Most other powerful leaders throughout history took power and held on to it as tight as they could for as long as they could. King George III is an example of this. George Washington could not have been more different. King George had asked the American painter Benjamin West what Washington would do after the Americans won the Revolutionary War. West replied, They say he will return to his farm. The king replied, if he does that, he will be the greatest man in the world. Fast fact. Historians think that King George may have died mad or crazy because he was poisoned with arsenic. Interesting. So, if I look back at my page, what was he famous for? I think it's pretty safe we could say King George was famous for being the king. He was the king of Great Britain. I'll make this a little bit smaller. During the American Revolution. Okay. I would say that's what he is most famous for. And other information, again, this could be anything that was interesting from the passage. Personally, I think towards the beginning, they talked about that he founded a Royal Academy of Arts, and he loved to read. He opened a royal collection of books. That's what I think I'm going to add. And I'm just going to copy and paste. So, ooh, way big. So let's make that smaller. You can choose whatever you would like. It doesn't have to be the same thing as me. If you want to find a different fact, totally fine. Whatever you thought was the most interesting. Then, George Washington, I think there are 2 things that we probably need to put for George Washington. First is he was the leader of the American Army during the, I'm just going to shorten it to AMREV or American Revolutionary War and just put AMREV. So I think that was a big part. And then I also think he was the first president of the United States, because that happened right after the American Revolutionary War was done. And we could add even more to that. The fact that he gave up after 2 terms, we still have that rule in place today, that no president can be in office for longer than 2 terms. And that's honestly because of George Washington, the fact that he felt he didn't want anybody to start having like king-like power, right? That's what they had just fought against. Other information, I might put that, the fact that he only stayed 2 terms. He only stayed for 2 terms during his presidency. You can choose whatever floats your boat, whatever stood out to you. So that's what you're going to do for Patrick Henry and Benjamin Franklin today. If you look back in Canvas, we've got our Patrick Henry page or Benjamin Franklin page, and it has links to the readings there. And you're going to fill out, again, the allegiance. Was he a patriot, a loyalist, a neutral? What was he most famous for? Remember, there's going to be a lot that these people are famous for, but what was he most famous for? Remember, we're focusing on during the time of the American Revolution, and then one other fact, whatever it may be. So you're going to do that for Patrick Henry. You're going to do that for Benjamin Franklin. You are not going to turn this page in today because we're going to continue. We still have those 5 others that we're going to do tomorrow. We'll do the other 5 men tomorrow. If you need to revisit this video, you can do so. If not, you're going to move on to do our last 2 for today.